the next two speakers are going to be zooming in on productivity and also net zero. So first up, we have Kevin Lunny. Kevin is the Operations Director at Mannock, and Mannock, who have recently celebrated a giant step forward in decarbonising cement production. So I'm going to invite Kevin up to share his presentation, and there's a really good video in there as well. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Melanie, and thank you all for coming along. I just want to go through, I guess, a few points, just firstly by way of background of who we are. So Mannock is a business based down in the border between Fermanagh and Cavan. We employ 818 staff, and principally we are a manufacturer of heavy-side product for the construction sector. And a lot of our products would go into, obviously, traditional construction and also into the off-site build products. So we make insulation, for example. We make cement, which is our biggest product. We make blocks. We make aircrete blocks for the building sector. We make standard blocks, and we make a whole range of aggregate materials for the construction trade. I suppose one of the interesting parts about us is we have the border running right through our operations. So when Brexit came along, it was obviously quite an interesting challenge for a period of time. And particularly when you take the context of the situation where we send about 90 articulated loads of material to the UK from this complex every day. And that complex of material is made up of light goods and heavy goods, some of which are manufactured in Northern Ireland and some of which are manufactured in Southern Ireland. So when we got into the whole concept of producing customs documentation for products that are going out through, perhaps out through Rosslare over to the UK, or going out through the Belfast ports to the UK, and the relevant documentation to integrate with Irish Revenue, HMRC, but imports and exports, it was a particular challenge. I'll come back to that a little bit further, but it just gives you a little bit of a context of what we're trying to deal with. And I suppose it leads quite neatly into the whole digitisation process, because we wouldn't do this. We wouldn't be capable of doing this unless we had a fairly substantial digitisation programme. I suppose what we've done, and I think I just have a couple of slides of introduction, my main focus is on decarbonisation. But I suppose we've embraced this probably about 5 years ago, the whole context of productivity and digital. And from my point of view, very much these are all interrelated. They're very much part of the same process, and one dovetails with the other. So we've implemented Lean and Six Sigma in quite a number of our plants, and we're continuing to roll that out, focused heavily on the operations of the business in the manufacturing of the products that we've got. But dovetailing with that, under our what we call our Leading Excellence programme is the whole skills and development programme, which provides targeted training. And again, all of this leads, there's a digitisation element to all of this. Sustainability is one of the core 4 pillars of what we do, and continuous improvement feeds into that as well. So I think it's important to note that these things are not to be seen in isolation. Sustainability, digitisation, training, development, they're all part of the one programme, and we've tried to develop that under the Leading Excellence framework. So just some examples of some of the things we've done. I suppose it's just getting into the whole process of 5S, Six Sigma, all those various stages. So we've started a significant programme of change, and I suppose the few questions was asked earlier on, who does all this fit within the organisation? We developed a role in our organisation called Business Change, and there's a head of Business Change, and the Business Change role is definitely not an IT person. I think that's a significant, important note. They're involved in looking at process change, analysing what we're doing, and trying to build efficiencies into the process. So we have implemented quite a lot of digitisation, quite a lot of improvement programmes across the board. And I suppose just to give you some of the examples of what we've done, and I'm not going to labour this point because that has been covered in other areas, but we have transformation programmes in place for production and optimisation, and we have started to include some expert systems, and I guess I call them semi-AI, in terms of the processes that we adopt. In the whole maintenance routines, we have some very significant costs associated with maintenance, and we've developed those. Transport and customs, I mentioned earlier on, particularly around the whole export-import side for materials coming in, but more importantly for exporting material to the UK. Environmental health and safety management is something that we've digitised, and I know it was mentioned earlier on some comments about access to sites and all that sort of stuff, but what we've sought to do is to integrate that with things like insurance covers. Our insurance is in date for subcontractors coming in the gate. What is the certification for the individuals involved? Have they got the right certification for coming onto site, coming onto our sites or any other sites that we're involved with? Skills and training, we developed a very significant piece of work around digitisation. Really, this is converting what was paper-based written training and standard operating procedures into a digitised format. So we now have a programme whereby every operation that we do in the plant, in any of our plants, has been certified by Health and Safety, but it's a video. And we show the video and we train the video, and then there's a test on the video for any individual who's coming into the company. And that has been probably one of the most transformative things we have achieved, because we have identified in that all these binders of standard operating procedures that everybody writes and gets in place for ISO 9000 or whatever that happen to be, nobody reads them. So what we have to do is try to bring that out onto the factory floor. So we have training stations right throughout the plant whereby they will actually, all the workers have the opportunity to pull up the video. They're tagged, they're indexed, and they can watch the video about a particular procedure. And you can be sure they can do that in the context that they are doing it the correct, safe way, which has been certified by Health and Safety. That's a significant thing. Energy management, and this starts to lead us on into the whole context of sustainability. Energy management is huge. We are spending probably about 40 to 45 million pounds per annum on energy, between electricity and coal, sorry. So having that controlled and making whatever possible savings in that and having it as efficient as possible is major. I'm just going to touch on briefly the context of LCAs and EPDs. Life cycle analysis for the production of our products and sending our products to architects or to construction companies across both Ireland and the UK with the relevant EPDs is critical to our function. So we have digitised the product from that perspective. We have, insofar as we can control the carbon content in those, it goes with them, and that's a key thing. So obviously happy to talk a little bit more about that, because that's not necessarily the main focus of what I'm about. I want you to learn off this slide by heart, and I'm going to question you at the end. This is just an example of what we needed to do for Transport and Customs when we started to do this. So really it's just an identification to say we needed to analyse this in a very detailed way between our ERP systems, our customers, our haulage organisations. How is the whole process going to work? And while it was challenging and difficult, I'm glad to say at this stage that everything that we send to the UK is now totally automated. We don't have any paper in that process. So that is a prime example of how somebody had to deal with a very difficult and new problem and present it. So we've gained efficiencies in that. There's still obviously some overhead in running that process, but it has allowed us to export those 90 loads of mixed loads of product every day. And the mixed load context is extremely important for us from a sustainability point of view, because if we're sending a truck to London from Fermanagh, we don't want to send it half full with a load of cement on the bottom. We want to send it with a load of cement plus a load of insulation on the top, so that it's a full load, an efficient load, a sustainable load. Customers on the other end really like that because they get one load instead of two. And that's really one of our unique selling points. How can we compete selling product into the UK on that basis? So really, that's just a context to do that. When the Brexit thing came along, we were worried about it because it was potentially going to upset our USP. But thankfully, we've got that sorted and we're fully integrated with all the relevant customs authorities on whatever stage you are. I just want to talk a little bit now about sustainability. And I suppose as a cement manufacturer, probably one of the highest polluters in Northern Ireland, we were very conscious of this from an early stage. And I suppose in many senses, thinking about the philosophical questions around this, I suppose we had to evolve our thinking. I suppose we were sitting as a major focus point for an organisation producing a lot of carbon into the system. So I suppose in many stages when we started the process, we were kind of taking the low road, maybe let's not say too much about this. We're a big polluter. Let's wait and see what everybody else does. Let's figure out if somebody else maybe can come up with the solutions before we can. But the more we started to think about this, we realised that probably doesn't work. We needed to start to think about this in a slightly different manner. And we started to look at this and said, let's tackle this problem head on. We are a producer of somewhere around 800,000 tonnes of carbon per annum in Northern Ireland. or in Northern Ireland, sorry, in Ireland, because the cement factory is based just south of the border, but we have a plant in the north as well. So majority of it is produced in that region. And what are we actually going to do with that? Everybody else is maybe going on to different opportunities around carbon capture and carbon storage and all these things, but we don't have some of those opportunities. So we needed to really tackle this problem head on. And we have been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years, and I'm glad to say at this stage we think we're making some progress. We're certainly not there, but we think we have a pathway to progress, and I think where we're at the minute is trying to think ahead. And some of the things that we've done more recently is actually trying to create an opportunity out of some of the issues that we've got. We're a large producer of carbon in an isolated area. We're 100 miles from any port, and 60% of our business goes to the UK. How do you solve that problem? So I suppose those are the types of things we're trying to figure out. And about 2 years ago, we set about really looking at this, and we got our board together and we got working groups together, and we started to produce what we called our 2030 sustainability vision. And within that business, we got our board to recognise, first of all, and our financiers to recognise this is something that you're going to have to sort. If you don't do this within the next 5 to 7 years, you're not going to have a business. And we know that. So I suppose where we ended up with that is we ended up with a sustainability vision where this is sort of the key point, and I think it's no harm to mention it because it's something that everybody has to make this transformation in our belief. So we've set about the main driving force of that is where we've said is we have a moral and ethical obligation to do everything in our power and sphere of influence to offset the worst effects of the 3 global crises that we're all facing: climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution of the environment. Now, if you were to look at that and say, well, Monarch is probably the organisation that's the most influencing those in its region. So how do we fix that? Because we still have 800 people that we have to employ, and we can't just sort of close the book on it and say it's not going to work. So what we did was we developed a whole range of things in that sustainability vision around people, planet and partners, and it allows us to focus on all sorts of things around development of our personnel, training, development, health and safety, which we mentioned, and also our position in the community and the position with our customers. So that led on to things like developing the EPDs so that we could give those to customers and construction companies. It allows us to get involved with local schools, whereby we would set up a Monarch Futures programme, and in that Monarch Future programme we have partnerships with local schools, and it's one of the most transformative things we've done. So we are now a formal partnership in place with 6 local schools, 1 in Cavan and 5 in Fermanagh secondary schools, whereby we actually go into the school and talk to them about real problems, real issues around sustainability, real engineering issues, real things that are important. And the feedback that we got from the schools, it's hugely educational for us because the school kids who are really looking at everything from digitisation through to the current thinking in relation to social values, they're telling us what this needs to be. And I suppose we're taking that on board and trying to develop it into a programme for the future. So we have schools programmes, we have apprenticeship programmes, we have graduate programmes, we've experienced ongoing lifelong training programmes. And the more you put into that, while initially, we said, look, this is a bit of an overhead, can we spend all this money, this time on this? Very, very quickly you realise that the value you're getting back is a multiple of anything you're putting into it. So I just encourage people to think about that. Specifically with Mount Lourdes School in Enniskillen, we developed a partnership in sustainability, and again, the value associated with that is immense. We put a live camera, into one of the quarries that we use for the cement plant, and inside the quarry, in the quarry, there was a nesting site for kestrels. So we'd noticed that these kestrels were coming back every year. So we put a camera in, and then we put a live feed into the school. And the amount of positivity that we received from the girls in the school, watching the cameras, watching the eggs hatching, seeing the kestrels develop, and then fly away. And then when are they coming back, and the education associated with that allowed us then to promote the concept with Ulster Wildlife, where we did a natural assets action plan, where Ulster Wildlife actually studied all of our 2,000 acres that we control. And they said to improve biodiversity in the best way possible, what you should do is do this, plant trees of this nature there, try to do something with that invasive species. And now we have a programme of works where all the workers are starting to get involved in protection of biodiversity on the lands that we control. So a significantly positive feeling around all that is what is driving some of our activity. But the real issue, I suppose, where the rubber meets the road is around carbon reduction. And we're a cement producer, so how do we actually get the carbon out of cement? I suppose a couple of things maybe to note. This is a calculation of the submissions that we make to the EU ETS scheme. You'll see on for 22, which is the year just ended, 64% of the carbon that comes from the manufacture of cement, which this is really the manufacture of clinker. Clinker is the first stage in cement manufacture. There's two stages. You manufacture clinker and then you blend it with various materials to make cement. So the core measure is the carbon intensity of cement, of clinker, and 64% of that doesn't come from any fuel. It comes from effectively the melting of limestone or the burning of limestone and calcination. So even if you have a totally renewable fueled cement plant, you're still going to get 64% of the carbon that comes out of it comes out of the limestone. And you can't do anything else. Right back to the Roman times, people have needed cement. People have needed to melt limestone and produce what's called Portland cement. Now, there are various other things which I'll mention, and there's some things which can help a little bit, but just to bear that in mind, 64% of it comes from that. Our focus and the focus of the cement industry to date has been to focus on the removal of coal, and we are making significant progress on that. The particular activities that we've been doing over the last number of years has been introducing new technology, which effectively takes out coal and puts something else in instead. So the standard approach to this is to remove coal and replace it with a thing called solid recovered fuel, which is really a waste industry derived product. So instead of incinerating waste, you use it as a cement fuel. And that has been the driving force. Maybe just to mention one thing, the carbon intensity, if you'll note at the bottom of this, is the carbon intensity of our cement clinker is 0.832. So in other words, of every tonne of clinker that we produce, 0.832 tonnes of carbon is produced. So it's a massive number. So we manufacture about, give or take, about 1 million tonnes of cement per year. So you're talking about 800,000 tonnes of CO2. There's really no other way to get out of that except start to focus on the points in turn. So I suppose what we've done is the Fuel Flex system, which we launched about a month ago, really was a new piece of new technology. We did a piece of research with an equipment manufacturer out of Denmark, and we actually did a 5-year development cycle to actually introduce a new piece of equipment. It's a world first, and that allows us to reduce that 0.83 down to somewhere around 0.79. So a significant enough move. We have also some further work planned, which will go in next year, which will introduce some of the same technology into the kiln stage, which again would be kind of getting out there in relation to the technology that's available in cement plants, but we're kind of pushing the end. We're hoping to push the envelope. And we have an objective in our sustainability plan to reduce our CO2 intensity by 33% by 2030. Those two pieces of equipment will take down somewhere around 1/3 of that. It will get us to about 1/3 of that 33%, somewhere around 10-12%. So a significant move, even in a short space of time. It's quite interesting. When we looked at this at the start, we said, how can we deal with this problem? But when we actually look at it, it begins to realise that actually there is some possibilities. There's other things which we can do, and it starts to get into some other technologies. So the next one is a change of a burner. There's a new burner being developed by FLS, which is the principal cement manufacturer of equipment in the world. And they're hoping to introduce that to us at some point next year, with a view that we'd have it operational by 25. And the last one, I suppose, is one of the difficulties you've got with cement plants is you can do a lot with removing coal, but coal is a very, very high energy density carrier. And you need something, if you're going to get rid of coal, which is a high density material, a high energy density material. Hydrogen is such a material, but it's very hard to get green hydrogen unless you have access to significant volumes of renewables. Now, funny enough, we happen to live in Fermanagh in one of the highest yielding renewable energy wind sites in the country. Then wind coming in from the North Atlantic, actually there's a number of wind farms there already, and that's why they've been put there. They're very high yielding. So what we've been training is a number of projects now to start to generate significant volumes of renewable energy from new wind farms, so that we can actually feed that directly into the cement plant for electrification, but secondly into the production of a high density material such as hydrogen, green hydrogen, to get rid of the last lump of coal that we've got in the system. And I suppose just to give you some sort of numbers then on that, 0.832 comes down somewhere around, on the fuel side, we can probably see ourselves getting rid of about 60% of that by 2030, and on the overall basis, we get down to about 23%. But that still leaves us with all this stuff that we've got coming out of the limestone that actually doesn't help at all. So I suppose we'll come back to that in a second, but I suppose what we wanted to just talk briefly, this is the FuelFlex. This is the project that we launched to quite significant international acclaim about a month ago, and it's been very, very good for us. It actually has put us now in the position internationally that we have a significant story to tell. And within that, we're now starting to see visitors coming through our plant. So this is a visit from South Korea, a number of very efficient South Korean engineers, and it was quite interesting to see those guys coming here. We're typically going out to look at the new technologies that they're doing out in South Korea to see what's happening in the world. They were actually coming here to see some of the new stuff, so we're quite pleased about that. The new JetFlex burner, just to mention again, not to go into too much detail, but we're internationally collaborating with a number of plants. We had a very useful collaboration with a project in Slovakia, which has introduced a new burner. And really the main point on this is supposed to show that typically these are one pipe. You would have been pumping out large volumes of coal out into the kiln and burning it to produce limestone. This very sophisticated piece of equipment allows you to do various things: oxygen, hydrogen, SRF, various other fuels, ideally aimed at changing from coal to a new renewable process. But there's a lot in that. There's a lot of engineering, and there's a graph, there's a plan there to show you these are significant engineering projects to change a cement plant from one thing to another. And you might wonder, well, you know, is this whole thing financeable? And it is a little bit of a concern because there's a lot to do that. And I suppose we've a number of choices. We can decide that we can't produce cement anymore and lose our 800 staff and reduce the economic wealth of the area, or we have to try this. And once you start to look at that and look at that positively, and you look at the fact that you have wind, and you look at the fact that you have technology that you can actually do, and you look at the fact that there is a lot of positives coming to bear at the same time, and just try and focus in on it, I think there's lots of things we've been able to do. I just mention also, because there's another stage of development around the whole concept of producing hydrogen in larger scale to do a number of things. The production of hydrogen is quite a complex process, it's quite energy intensive, but we're working with a company called Catagen, which is based in Belfast, a very innovative organisation, and we're collaborating with a number of international European players to they produce hydrogen in a more efficient way. So we're now starting to develop the concept of taking waste heat from the plant, which is effectively free, and producing hydrogen, which can then be compressed in line and produced, and potentially then moved through that process to produce a syngas, or it was mentioned earlier on, an e-diesel out of that process. It's highly energy intensive, but the technology is now starting to come into play, and I think hopefully there'll be some good stuff coming out of that. Just want to mention briefly, there's a number of activities that we're doing, because this is not a one-stop shop. You need to look at all sorts of things. I mentioned about materials, I mentioned about energy, I mentioned about efficiency, I mentioned about digitization, and I mentioned about research. So there's a whole series of things around this. And there's also the whole concept of what you do with the cement once you have it made. Are you actually utilising it in the most efficient way possible? So what we've been doing recently is starting to work with people like Carbon Cure. They're an American company which actually take carbon and put it into concrete products, ready-mix products, and from those products they can displace some of the cement. So now we have a lower carbon, the carbon is sequestered fully into the product. You actually are producing less cement and you're sequestering carbon. That's really a trial process, so when we get to the next stage of development, we're trying to take that 60% of CO2 that's coming out of the process and trying to capture it. Then we have to figure out, what are we actually going to do with it? So the concept is that we will start to put it into the products, reduce the cement content in the product at the same time, and reduce the overall CO2 intensity by doing that. I suppose I just want to talk briefly then a little bit about some of the things we've been doing. Again, we're based on the border, so we link up with Cavan County Council and Leitrim County Council, and obviously Fermanagh and Omagh District Council. So we've been working through a process of trying to figure out how we can take it to the next step. And because of some of the things I've mentioned already about high wind area, road fleet, we've developed this concept of a green hydrogen valley, which actually is now morphing into a green energy valley because it sort of broadens out beyond that. There's a number of stages in this, and rather than me trying to explain these, what I'll ask is if it's possible to run the video now. It's just a short video, explains the concept of this green energy valley, and then we can follow on at the end.
Introducing Mannock Energy Valley, a concept with the potential to transform an already progressive industrial base into a truly sustainable powerhouse of employment, clean energy and future economic prosperity in the heart of the Border region. Harnessing natural and renewable energy sources, driving innovation in sustainable technology. Replacing 4 million litres of diesel per year. Decarbonising the production of cement by removing over 500,000 tonnes of CO2 annually. Powering 3 large manufacturing facilities with almost 150 gigawatt hours of renewable energy per year, in a closed-loop process which utilises carbon capture technology, generated oxygen and green hydrogen, made possible because of the unique location and diverse nature of the Mannock Business Suite. A multi-phase 15-year energy transformation programme, each of which are self-financing and will support the nation's net zero target. Energy Valley underpins the numerous and wide-ranging sustainability initiatives defined in the Mannock 2030 vision and will bring us to within touching distance of true energy independence. Situated on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the region's unique opportunities make Energy Valley a particularly viable and potentially one-off concept, with proven high-yield onshore wind and already existing high levels of curtailed and constrained wind capacity. High localised energy demand with large-scale tethered road transport fleet which can utilise hydrogen or its derivatives as a main fuel. High demand for oxygen, a byproduct of the electrolysis process, which is normally vented but in this context becomes highly valuable. A well-invested manufacturing technology base which facilitates the rapid adaptation to a new generation renewable fuels including green hydrogen, oxy-fuel and synthetic fuels, using existing access and utility infrastructure. Renewable power derived from curtailed and baseload wind generation capacity close to the plant will be used to power a new 5 megawatt electrolysis plant which will generate green hydrogen sufficient to convert over 70% of Mannock's 150 heavy goods truck fleet to fully renewable power. Oxygen generated from the process will be used to introduce a new, cleaner oxy-fuel combustion cycle to the cement business. Combustion in an enhanced oxygen atmosphere improves burn efficiency, increases plant capacity and reduces emissions. The flue gases which are produced contain less nitrogen with a high CO2 concentration, making the carbon easier to capture and sequester rather than vent. This clean capture of CO2 enables its permanent sequestration into ready-mix and concrete products under a process known as carbon cure, which is already gaining significant traction in the sector. New dedicated wind and solar installations of up to 150 megawatt combined capacity constructed next to the cement plant, which will be designed to replace all current grid electricity demand. This will progressively replace over 50% of total energy requirement in the business with green alternatives over the next 15 years. This will facilitate further cost-competitive electrification of the cement plant and the introduction of green hydrogen as an alternative fuel to the cement production process. It also will allow the existing grid-sourced electricity demand from our PIR, packaging and related manufacturing facilities to be replaced by direct connection to the new dedicated renewable energy capacity. Emerging technology in large-scale carbon capture and use will capture increasing amounts of CO2 from the cement plant and combine this with additional green hydrogen to produce a new generation of synthetic fuels, including methanol and dimethyl ether. It is expected that these fuel alternatives will enable the business to close the loop entirely in some application areas where hydrogen is not a suitable fuel for direct use. MANOC is collaborating with numerous technology providers in the delivery of the transformation programme, which includes specialists in the renewable sector as well as leading research institutions, government bodies and international equipment providers. Realisation of the Energy Valley concept will ensure the business becomes a truly sustainable entity for the next and future generations.
I'm conscious of the time, but I suppose what we've done on that is, set out a sort of a very planned process, some of which will happen in the next couple of years, some of which are already in place. We've already, you might have seen, we received funding from BEIS for a project to take curtailed wind from an existing wind farm to produce hydrogen in the first instance to replace the diesel in the lorries. And that programme is now started and that study is now going in place. And that will take curtailed wind. Because we're on the west of the province, there's lots of curtailed wind, about between 12 and 14% of wind capacity can't get back onto the network. So this concept will actually take that wind because it's free, and we'll take that and produce hydrogen and use the hydrogen in the lorries. There's obviously challenges with the timescale for getting lorries, etc., but that's that. And then various other stages of that go through, which we've outlined in the overall plan. That's just some slides there which indicate we've actually started to do the work on where the wind farm will actually be located. And the scaling and sizing and engineering design is now started in that. We've also included solar in that because solar and battery are probably going to play a part in this if we're going to become a sort of a truly independent, energy independent entity. I suppose one of the things that's challenging for us is how do we, once we do all of that, I think it's maybe important to point out one of the big processes, or the government policy in the UK is to, for large carbon emitters, is this concept of carbon clusters. So what they're doing in the UK is, in the Midlands and down south in various places, they have this idea where you, if you're in an industrial base, your carbon will effectively go into a pipe if you're a large producer, and that pipe will be then piped out to either the North Sea or out into the Irish Sea, into disused oil and gas fields. So I suppose that's what the British government is putting on. They're putting lots of announcements at the moment on how that's going to happen and putting money against that in this concept of carbon clusters. And that's grand if you're in a carbon cluster and you're fairly close to a pipe that can actually take your carbon and go out and pump it into the North Sea, into the Mile. But if you're sitting in Ballyconnell or Derrylin, it's unlikely we're going to get a pipe to Derrylin. So what we have to try and figure out is how do we deal with that? And those are the types of challenges we have. So it goes back to that whole concept about sequestration of carbon locally, sequestration of carbon into products, sequestration of coming up with new ideas of how we take that probably about 500,000 tonnes of CO2 that will come from the limestone after we've all the other bits done, and coming up with new solutions. And we're integrating with various international organisations now around ideas to do that. Carbon Built is one. It was mentioned about recycling concrete material. That's another organisation there's an organisation focused on that. There's Carbon Re, there's Carbon Upcycling, which specialise in taking carbon out of flue stacks and putting it into material which can then be transformed into building materials or other things. They're very early stage, but really the point I'm making is that this is a multiple facet process and takes significant effort to try to do that. I think it was also mentioned earlier on about ESG and how do you turn the tanker. I suppose as a cement producer, we are probably the tanker. So we're trying to figure out how do we actually get that done and develop our program. So we're involved obviously with people, very good organisations, Business in the Community, NA, who've helped us to come up with new thinking in this space. And I suppose I would encourage people to not be, disillusioned about what's possible. We are probably at the very tough end of the wedge in this, but all the materials, all the cement that goes into any construction has to come from that. And we think it's important that we don't simply close the book on it and rely on cement producers from other parts of the world. We think it's important to have an ingrained indigenous cement producer here in Northern Ireland. And we also like to tell people that everywhere we go, we plant trees. Thanks very much.
you so much, Kevin. That was really interesting, and I suppose fantastic to hear about the progress really that you're making on your collaborative international R&D projects. I mean, you touched on lots of things there: energy, digitisation, R&D, lots of different things. But one of the things that resonates with me is that the company just seems to have this culture of doing the right thing as well, and I think that can't be undervalued either. Okay, moving on to our next speaker. So up next we have Liam McAvoy from SustainIQ. Liam is the co-founder of SustainIQ and very passionate about sustainability and improving business competitiveness. Welcome.
Thanks, Melanie. Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. We're going to spend about the next 20 minutes or so just exploring how we really should be taking a more data-driven approach to net zero and our net zero goals and targets over the coming years. And before I get into the presentation, just picking up on a couple of the questions before the break. Someone had mentioned about demolishing or not, and if there was any examples. So I would just encourage you to look at UCL, University College London, did a project. The Bartlett School of Architecture, Gilbert Ash delivered that, so it's well worth a look in terms of what they did there. And then someone else raised a point around social value and the policing of that. So obviously we know social value is going to be up to 20% weighting in tenders now in Northern Ireland coming this summer, and the SIB have developed a whole new point system around how that's going to be policed. So again, I would encourage you to look at the SIB website just to find out a little bit more about the new point system as well. Okay, just getting back then to today. Make sure I've got that right, yeah, okay. I think, look, first of all, I'm going to very briefly run through net zero to make sure we all understand it and we're all on the same page. Going to take a look at some of the drivers. I know we picked up on that earlier as well, but I think it's important we know what the drivers are, what's pushing net zero up our corporate agendas at such a rapid pace, particularly within our sector. I think it's important we understand our own greenhouse gas emissions within our own organisations, because we need to know that to really get the planning, get the strategy in place, and then how you can use those emissions to get started. And again, for any of you in the room today that maybe haven't yet started, there's no need to panic. We've got a window of opportunity, and there's a few simple steps that we can all take. And I'll wrap up by taking a look at some best practice examples as well. So look, very briefly, obviously I'm Liam, I'm one of the co-founders of SustainIQ. I've worked in sustainability and construction for around 18 years, 16 of which I had to drag everyone to the table kicking and screaming to have the conversation about sustainability. That's completely flipped now in the last 18 months, 2 years. More so to do with the carbon agenda, and a lot of people now want to have that conversation, which is great. SustainIQ itself is the all-in-one ESG and sustainability reporting software solution. So we make it easy for our customers to capture their sustainability data across all of their different projects, offices and factories and so on, and then we make it easy through our reporting dashboard for them to report their performance to stakeholders as well. And we're really passionate then about working very closely with our customers to make sure they use that data in the boardroom by senior managers to help them make those big investment decisions that we're going to have to make. And Kevin just outlined quite a few there down at Manic that they're doing. So the data is critical to that, both in making an informed decision, but then also once you make that investment, measuring the impact it's actually having. And again, you need the data to be able to do all of that. So a little bit more about us later, but firstly, if we just get into the presentation around net zero. So again, I'm sure many of you already know this, but just making sure we're all on the same page. Net zero means achieving a balance between greenhouse gas emissions put into the atmosphere and then those taken out. So one of the best analogies I got a couple of years ago, which just made a click, was by thinking of it like a bath. So reaching net zero requires us to balance the amount we emit with the amount that we then remove. And really, what does it mean for all of us here today, and how is it going to impact our businesses? So companies are now setting targets to commit reducing their greenhouse gas emissions that are aligned with the pathway to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And we're seeing more and more companies go public with their own targets, 2030, 2040 and beyond as well. And carbon removal and offsetting are going to be critical to that. I think it's important as well, we talk a lot about carbon, but obviously it applies to all 7 greenhouse gas emissions as well. So depending on your organisation, it's just important to factor that in. And then net zero itself, and why this is so important and why we're talking about this so much as well. Net zero is obviously an internationally agreed goal to mitigating further global warming, and what we do in the next 10 years will really determine whether or not we've been successful or not. And I think business 10 years from now is going to look very, very different in terms of how we all operate our own businesses, particularly around the carbon agenda as well. And I think it's important, I think someone mentioned it earlier as well, it's not just us. I think sometimes it's easy for construction to feel like we're being picked on. It's every sector, it's every country, and every industry that this is impacting, and it's important that we're aware of what that impact is on our own organisations and what we're going to do to tackle the challenges that lie ahead. Okay, so hopefully we're all agreed with regards to the net zero topic itself, but then just looking at some of those key drivers and what is driving it up the agenda. We've mentioned a few of those international drivers, certainly the Paris Agreement, where a lot of the countries stepped forward and made those 2050 commitments, which we're now starting to see filter through. We've got the likes of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. I know many of you in the room today have aligned their own ESG and sustainability strategies with many of the SDG goals. But then nationally, we've got a lot of legal drivers, such as SECR, the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting legislation. So again, many of you in the room today will already be returning their carbon emissions to Companies House with their financial returns. We've got other pieces of legislation, such as ESOS, the Energy Saving Opportunity Scheme. In the EU, before Christmas, they signed off on CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which is very much aligned with non-financial reporting. And that's going to impact all of us operating within the EU, potentially over the next couple of years. And then we've got GPP, Green Public Procurement, again in the south, which is now tied up within all public tenders, public procurement contracts. So anyone there tendering for work potentially impacted by GPP as well. And then we've got a lot of commercial drivers as well. So obviously we've spoke a little bit about those PQQs and tenders, and in particular today we're focusing on net zero. We're seeing a lot more net zero questions coming through, and there's a hunger, I think, now for data to support that you're doing what you say you're doing. So those clients now want to see evidence of your drive towards net zero as well. So having access to data for that is critical. Clients themselves are a lot, in terms of their expectations, they're quite hungry for their suppliers to step forward and take the lead, work with them collaboratively to try work towards net zero goals as well. And we're seeing a definite increase in the amount of clients of our customers that are looking for carbon reduction plans. They want to see what the next 10, 15, 20 years looks like as well. So there's lots of drivers. We spoke a little bit about stakeholders as well. It's not just clients. I know Lorraine had mentioned at McAvoy Group around the recruitment, particularly of new recruits coming in, having a focus on responsible businesses and so on, but certainly your employees, your subcontractors, your suppliers. If you've got investors behind the business, again, investors now want to make sure they're not investing in a company that is negatively impacting the environment or negatively impacting a local community somewhere. So they're doing their due diligence and they're using ESG to do that. And again, then the public themselves. Everyone now is more aware and they want to work for or they want to work with responsible businesses. So lots of drivers, they're pushing it up the agenda. Carbon itself obviously has been monetized, which is why I've never spoke to so many finance directors in my life as I've done in the last 12 months. They're obsessed. But it definitely is having a big impact. And the fact that we're now seeing in the UK companies that meet a certain criteria returning their carbon emissions to Companies House with financial returns, it kind of gives you an idea where this is going. There's going to be money, taxes, whatever you want to call it, in the not too distant future. So we've got this window of opportunity to do what we need to do to try to make those investments, similar to what Kevin was talking about down at Manic, build a business case. If you were paying for it today, how much would it be? And use that as a business case to start looking at future investments to help drive down emissions within the business, looking at maybe transitioning over to EVs, investment in renewables, whatever it might be. But it's important to start building those business cases. Some of them will be low-hanging fruit, can be done quite quickly. Some of them will require significant investment, so you need to build in time to plan for that as well. Okay, and then I think as well it's very important that you understand your own emissions within your own businesses and the impact all of this is going to have on you. So again, a lot of you will be familiar with this, but the Greenhouse Gas Protocol has broken emissions now down into 3 scopes, and we're all now talking about either Scope 1, Scope 2 or Scope 3. Scope 1 being direct emissions, so typically your company fleet of vehicles, if you own them and you're paying for the fuel. If you're bringing fuel on sites for plant and equipment, for welfare, all going to be Scope 1. Scope 2 typically would be maybe electricity. It's being produced off-site, you're using it on-site. But with regard to Scope 1 and Scope 2, you're all paying for it. There's invoices in your businesses, there's a bill there, and you've got direct influence over what you can actually do to reduce those emissions. So for example, Scope 1, as a business, you could start transitioning over towards EV. You've got the control to do that. Scope 2, again, with regards to even electricity, you could go to a green energy tariff, you could invest in renewables. So you've got the control and influence over 1 and 2 to do that. Scope 3 is very different. Those are emissions that are happening because of your business activity, but they're outside of your control. So typically maybe supply chain products and materials being delivered to site, that type of thing. But it's important, and Scope 3 by far will be your biggest chunk of emissions, and you will be expected to report on that as well. So the focus certainly on Scope 1 and Scope 2, but you can't forget about Scope 3. You can't kick it too far down the road. People want to see those reports now as well. And again, that diagram just really sets out and again, sort of hopefully, by looking at it, will help a lot of businesses understand, well, what is a Scope 1, what is a Scope 2, and what is a Scope 3 emission within our business. And then you can start sort of looking down and drilling down and identifying the different emission sources across the business as well, both upstream and downstream. So it's really time to just start asking lots of questions within the business to really understand your emissions. So again, what emissions does your company produce, across Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, looking at those bills and those invoices for electricity, for fuel, whatever it might be, and starting to understand what is being produced first of all. And then it's important to drill down a little further and why are they being produced within the business, what business operations are they related to, where are they being produced, when are they being produced, who is producing them. Asking all of these questions helps you to then start to build a bigger picture of emissions right across your organisations, and that is really critical to understand all of that as you move forward in the next couple of years. Are they direct through your own business? Are they indirect, maybe through supply chain? And again, who's responsible? And once you start capturing all of that, you can start to calculate how many tonnes of CO2 you're producing. And I think that's critical to build that almost like a carbon inventory where you really understand your business, your emissions, and the impact all of this is going to have on you, and then you can start to plan going ahead to maybe start reducing them as well. And then once you have all of that information, it's important you start using it. So there's a lot of businesses out there, they have a lot of data, but they're not properly using it to the full potential. So I think it's important that you now start looking at it and understanding it and how it can help you then make those decisions in terms of strategy going forward and so on. So yeah, really just start interrogating it, looking at it, why maybe certain emission sources are, how if you even just look at construction, why is one project producing a lot more emissions than the other, maybe completed 6 months previous, similar value, similar sector. You start just asking those questions. There might be factors that it couldn't be avoided, but again, you start to see then trends coming through, and it's those trends really that are going to highlight the opportunities, but particularly the low-hanging fruit where you can have a big impact quite quickly as well. So again, it's important then to understand, by having access to all of that data, you understand your current position, so you set the baseline, you understand where you are right here, right now, you put your targets, your KPIs in place, you know where you want to get to, and then you continually review performance so you know where you're at if you're going in the right direction. So it's a continual monitoring, measuring and reporting process, which is where we come in with regards Sustain IQ as well. And again, the focus initially for those of you maybe just starting out should be on 1 and 2, but again, not to forget about Scope 3 as well. And then it's important to make a start. So again, I know a lot of this can be overwhelming, and we're all now starting to talk a new language, particularly around carbon. And so I think the best place for everyone to start is education. It's critical, it's key. with regard to your own employees, with regard to your supply chain as well. We've all got a responsibility to bring everyone with us on this journey. We cannot run the risk of leaving people behind. And as I say, we are speaking a new language, and so it is really up to us to invest in education and increase the amount of understanding and awareness around the carbon agenda, so that we can bring everyone with us on the journey as well. And those are just like 5 key steps that we like to implement with all of our customers, just to get everyone started. So it's, again, finding out and understanding your emissions, where you're currently at right now with regard to your own business operations. Put that baseline in place. Make those commitments, put those targets in place, you know where you want to get to. Create a plan, the strategy, how you're going to get there, what investment is needed to get there. Constantly implement and report on performances as well. So, and there's lots of support out there as well for all of us, and I would highlight a few. So the business in the community, Kevin again in his presentation highlighted BITC, they're a local organisation, and they can help you get started in your journey. They've got the BITC NI Climate Action Pledge, which you can all sign up to. It's a really good place to start with regards to reporting. The UK Green Building Council is another really good resource on their website. They've got lots of template carbon reduction plans and so on there as well. So I'd encourage you to go there and look at that. And then we ourselves have got the 6-step guide to getting started with ESG and sustainability reporting. So I'll share that with InvestNI, and maybe that could be shared with delegates here today as well. It's just it's a full ESG guide, but obviously net zero is part of that, so we can share that with you all as well. Okay, so just to wrap up and take a look at some examples, they are SustainIQ customers that we're going to look at. Just to give you a little bit more information about SustainIQ itself. So it's a software solution built across those 4 pillars, because for us it was important that we built a solution that captured data from all aspects of sustainability. There's lots of standalone elements out there, but we understand the power of bringing it all into one place, one dashboard. And so we achieved that by building SustainIQ across the 4 pillars that you see on screen. So responsible procurement focuses on all things to do with supply chain, products and materials. We've just launched an embodied carbon calculator for products and material. It's a prototype that's currently being tested. And we rely heavily on the likes of the EPDs, environmental product declarations from the manufacturers to do that. We've integrated with things like BIM, so we can pull through the design stage list of products and materials as well. And there's a supply chain portal in there where our customers can then collaborate with their supply chain, because again, looking at the direction of travel here, it's going to be really, really important that our customers can engage with particularly their key suppliers. They're going to be setting specific targets for those key suppliers over the coming years, and they need a space to collaborate, work together in order to achieve those goals. The environmental management pillar then, it just tracks all of the environmental performance across all projects, offices, factories, all waste management, all greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2 and 3, biodiversity, water usage and so on. People, health and diversity then is us moving into social value, so typically there we would be capturing apprenticeships and placement opportunities that are being created, health and well-being, diversity, inclusivity, training and development, safety and so on. And then the 4th and final pillar is community engagement and partnering. So there we track all of the performance around community initiatives, volunteering, charitable donations, school engagement. So we bring all of that in to one big central dashboard, and we do that through lots of different ways. We've got an API which allows for connectivity, so we can pull data automatically from different places. We've got bulk uploads, so spreadsheets can go in very easily. And then we've got the SustainIQ app where site teams are actually logging information straight into the app manually as well. So it all comes into one big dashboard, and there's lots of tools and functions where you can drill down, interrogate the data. And then within that, there's a reporting library where they can customize lots of reports for stakeholders. So we typically have customers delivering on BREEAM or LEED, and they're maybe reporting on GRI and all of the other sort of different sort of legislation and also sector standards as well. So obviously it does the full ESG thing. Today we're focusing in on the emissions piece. So just to give you an example, Gilbert Ash is one of our customers, obviously a UK Northern Ireland contractor operating across the UK. So Gilbert Ash use SustainIQ on all of their projects. They use all 4 SustainIQ pillars, so they have huge amounts of data coming in to the system every day across all of their different projects. And again, they're able to use that within their tender submissions, to report back out to clients and regulators and so on. So looking at one of their Premier Inn projects that they completed recently over in London for their client Whitbread, and Whitbread's very passionate about all things sustainability and ESG related. So Gilbert Ash are able to take a lead there, and they've got access to huge amounts of data that they can then share with their client. So they use SustainIQ to track performance across the job, and even from an emissions perspective, they were able to track that 21% of their Scope 1 emissions were produced on site. Then Scope 2 was 4%, and again, Scope 3 being the biggest chunk of emissions on that particular project. And Scope 3 for them, typically looking at deliveries coming to site. We've integrated with different sign-in biometric software as well, where we're able to pull through a lot of information around how supply chain subcontractors are travelling to and from work as well. So they're getting huge amounts of visibility, huge amounts of transparency, which again they're able to use and position themselves as a leader in this space, particularly with their clients as well. And that's just one job, obviously they're doing it across all of them. Felix O'Hare would be another customer of ours, obviously based in Uri, but working both in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Similar to Gilbert Ash, they would be tracking their performance across all 4 pillars and across all of their projects as well. So again, getting huge amounts of data through SustainIQ that they're able to use in lots of different ways to help improve performance within the business. So again, over at their St. Paul's National School in Navan project that they completed, they tracked all their emissions, but with regards to their Scope 3, 64% of all emissions on that job was related to that. And again, it was very much to do with supply chain, a little bit of product and materials as well. But they're forensically actually tracking all of their emissions across all of their projects, and they're now actively using that data within the business to really drive performance and try to get their emissions down on projects going forward as well. So look, there's a lot more on our website, case studies and testimonials, sustainiq.com. If you want to have a chat, find out a little bit more, you can get us on hello@sustainiq.com as well. Okay, thanks very much.
Ask Kevin to come back up as well. So again, lots of really interesting insights there from Liam on the SustainIQ platform, and indeed I'm a big passionate fan of data and love to see whenever it's included in platforms like that as well. We're going to open it up to the floor now for some questions. So if, again, same as last time, if you want to put your hands up and if you have some questions for Liam or Kevin, they'll be happy to answer those. Who's going to go first? People in the middle there.
Hi, Una from Felix O'Hare. I'm just wondering, in terms of the environmental product declarations, do you see that becoming widespread across the SMEs in Northern Ireland, or do we need to rely more on the UK average data to feed into that for the whole life carbon accounting?
Yeah, I'll go, Kevin. So yes, look, obviously at the minute, we, as I say, I've got that prototype out on our procurement pillar at the minute, and it is designed and built around the data that we need to get from the EPDs. So we are out there speaking with the manufacturers. Certainly we're seeing the larger manufacturers have a lot of this in place. You know, obviously they've invested. We you know, when you start looking at maybe the smaller manufacturers, it's getting a lot more patchy. There's not the same level of provision available. But I think there's a recognition that needs to change. And I think a lot of manufacturers are making a start on that. But at the minute, currently, there's not the same level with the smaller manufacturers, but it will, and you know, I'd say in the next 18 months, 2 years. There's also a lot of support, certainly even InvestNI, helping organisations, like EPDs, together, because they're being asked constantly now, particularly by main contractors, to provide that information. So there's a bit of work still to be done there, but definitely becoming more and more readily available.
I would add to that, yes. I mean, we supply really heavy-side product into Ireland and the UK, and we have EPDs for all the individual products. You wouldn't get on a supply list in some of the manufacturers or some of the distributors in the UK without having EPDs. So I think they're standard. You just need them.
One for Kevin, please. And may I say, what a fabulous presentation.
Thank you.
And what a proposal for the future. It's really, really something special. My question is twofold, Kevin. I'm interested in mobility and decarbonisation within mobility. So when you talk about decarbonising your heavy commercial vehicle fleet for distribution of your products, roughly within the plan, the footprint that you've given us, roughly what is the timeline before you've got hydrogen available for your vehicle fleet? And sorry, is it hydrogen for internal combustion engine, or is it hydrogen for hybrid for fuel cell electric?
In terms of when we might have it available, we're starting into the FEED study that we've got some funding from BEIS on. We're starting that now, so we could probably have that built within 2 years. Our challenge, though, with that is that the vehicles are not available. Yeah, so look, we're engaged with the various manufacturers insofar as we can engage, and there are some exemplary studies and implementations in Europe, particularly in Switzerland, where they have actually implemented a number of heavy goods vehicles. The challenge with heavy goods vehicles carrying material, electrification obviously would be simpler, but electrification doesn't give the level of power that you need to haul heavy goods, 30, 35 ton. So the challenge is the manufacturing companies, the Volvos, the Mercedes, etc., who are actually going to produce this equipment. So we're kind of working on that. I suppose there's a couple of things we've tried to do to mitigate that. We can use the hydrogen in the lorries, or we can actually use the hydrogen in the cement plant. So we've a little bit of an opportunity there. So we're trying to press ahead with production of the hydrogen from the curtailed wind and then extend that. But ideally, we want to get those lorries off diesel. So we're kind of working on that. But we are at the mercy of when those things become available. Second question, you said, look, we have... Interesting, very interesting question. We are looking at, in the first instance, the extender system, whereby you produce hydrogen, but it's really an electric vehicle that is extended by having a hydrogen tank on the truck. So that's kind of what our main focus is. But working with Catagen, that we've spoken about there, one option there is they have a relatively efficient method to take the hydrogen, compress it, and convert it into an e-diesel. And if we can take the CO2 out of the stack at the same time, then it's a win-win. So one option might be that we would look to a drop-in solution, at least maybe for an interim period, because we may be able to produce that relatively cost-effectively.
This is one for Kevin, Eve Smith, W&J Chambers and Drumahoe Concrete Yard. Just in relation to Carbon Cure, I'm aware Kilsaran and yourselves, and I'm actually working on a different kind of thing with the University of Ulster and also Queen's and Trinity in relation to low carbon concrete. But have you physically poured with Carbon Cure yet, is my first question. And also the strengths, if you physically poured, have you had it in place any length of time and done any analysis of the strengths over a period of time of having it test poured in situ in relation to durability, strength, and also I suppose practicality after it's been in place for a length of time?
Look at it, we're at the early stages of it. We've installed the tanks. We're starting to produce concrete with it. We haven't done it at scale, and we don't have a very large ready-mix business. The reason why we've got into the space to try and get involved with it is really to try to test out the concept and how it might perform at much larger scale, because we have huge volumes of carbon and we're trying to figure out is there a business case in that to produce it at large scale. So I don't think we're ready now to give you any definitive answers on it. From the initial analysis, we went into it with our eyes open. It's certainly not a silver bullet for this. It will potentially reduce the cement content to a proportion, but in proportion to the amount of carbon we've got, it's minuscule. So I understand the point and needs a lot of testing. I think it's a factor of this is what you're going to come up against almost immediately with standards and durability and all these things that are untried. But we're doing it at the moment really to learn from the exercise.
Thanks very much.
Hi, Gemma from RBMC. We consult with our clients on risk management and commercial best practice. And this question is probably more for Liam. There would be a lot of construction companies that are, say, traditional in the way that they work and the jobs that they undertake. What would you say is holding them back from making advancements, whether it be that digitally or sustainability-wise? And what do you think it's going to take to push them? Is it purely just legislation, or is there something else that's going to encourage these more traditional companies to make those steps forward?
Yeah, okay, good question. I think, look, there's lots of challenges. I think one of the biggest, because we're kind of in that data capture lane, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of the construction companies is access to data. So whenever we start working with a customer, typically we find that a lot of the data is already held, not all, but a lot of it is already held within the business with regard to ESG sustainability and particularly the emissions information, but it's all siloed. So it's living in other software systems, it's in desktops, it's on spreadsheets, and nothing is joined up, nothing's talking to each other. There's a lot of roles and responsibilities and lots of different departments now that are involved in sustainability as it's evolved over the years, and they just don't realise how important sharing that information might be for others in the organisation. So I think that siloed approach that many are currently having to deal with is one big challenge, and it's like, where do we start? But I think also that, you know, that leads into the fact that ESG, sustainability as a whole, it requires huge amounts of information. I think in the past there was such a strong focus on environmental. That in itself is a big task. But when you look at the S and the social now, you know, you're dealing with the HR departments, you're dealing with stakeholders, and then you're looking at the G, and you're bringing in procurement, you're bringing in supply chains as well. So there's huge amounts of information that's now needed to be brought into one central place so that companies are able to get a full overview of their performance and properly put a strategy in place and put those targets in place as well. And I think, look, with regards, I suppose, what is needed to help push them along, we're seeing in the last 12 months, we're seeing a huge uptake, and I think that's coming maybe more so through procurement, through tenders, through PQQs. Anyone working on those larger frameworks, for example, are now obligated to be reporting. So that's definitely pushing things along. Certainly CSRD in the EU has had a massive impact there too. So I think a lot of companies that before weren't maybe overly bothered now realise this is going to impact them from 2025 going forward. So definitely legal drivers also add a bit of a push. But as I said in my presentation, I think one of the key things is education and awareness, because I think, you know, when we start talking to people, you can see they're quite overwhelmed by it all. And they've no need to be, because you can break it down into different sort of chunks. But I think it's easy to get overwhelmed. And I think by educating employees and certainly working with the supply chain, make it a lot more manageable and realise that actually they've got time. There is a window of opportunity here to make a start and get a good plan in place.
Okay, I think that's all of the questions, and if you'd all like to just put your hands together and thank both Liam and Kevin for their presentations, it was brilliant.